The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, so quiet that the sound of heels striking the marble floor echoed like warnings. Evelyn Mercer, wife of respected police captain Samuel Mercer, walked in with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her chin was lifted, her eyes sharp, her posture announcing one message to the room. She was untouchable. But Judge Frank Caprio immediately sensed something else beneath her polished appearance. A heaviness, a tension, a crack in the armor she tried so hard to maintain. The case seemed simple at first, a reckless driving citation. Yet the moment Evelyn stood before the bench, the atmosphere tightened. She crossed her arms and spoke with a sharpness that surprised even the officers familiar with her. "I shouldn't be here," she snapped. "Do you know who my husband is?" Judge Caprio's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concern, because the real story wasn't in her words. It was in the way her voice trembled for half a second, in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way her fingers twitched when she mentioned her husband's name. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. When an officer quietly whispered that Evelyn had threatened them, claimed she could have their jobs with one phone call, Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, studying her with a calmness that made the entire room uneasy. He didn't see entitlement. He didn't see pride. He saw someone breaking from the inside, holding on to the last piece of control she thought she had. And what happened next, no one in that courtroom was ready for. Because Judge Caprio was about to uncover a truth Evelyn never wanted spoken out loud. A truth that would turn the entire courtroom silent and change her life forever. The tension in the courtroom didn't come from the case itself. It came from the woman standing at the center of it. Evelyn Mercer had always been known in her community as someone who carried herself with elegance and precision. She was the wife of Captain Samuel Mercer, a man whose reputation for fairness, bravery, and integrity had earned him deep respect in Providence. Together, they appeared to be the perfect law enforcement family. But Judge Frank Caprio had seen too many perfect surfaces to be fooled by one. As Evelyn stood before him, her expression was cold, her chin raised, but her eyes told a different story. They carried a shine that wasn't confidence. It was pressure. Years of it. The kind that slowly changed a person from the inside. Judge Caprio glanced at the file on his desk. A reckless driving violation. But attached to it was a separate note from responding officers. A note neither Evelyn nor her husband expected the judge to see. It described the moment she was pulled over, the agitation, the raised voice, and the unmistakable threat. "You'll regret stopping me." He looked up again. Evelyn kept adjusting her bracelet, tugging at the metal as though it irritated her skin. Her hands trembled just enough for a trained observer to notice. Caprio noticed everything. Behind her, a few spectators whispered among themselves. Officers lined the wall, their uniforms adding weight to the already heavy atmosphere. The tall windows cast long beams of morning light across the polished wooden benches, giving the room a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the tension lingering in the air. Evelyn's husband sat quietly in the back row, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. Captain Samuel Mercer had commanded dangerous operations, faced life-threatening situations, and held his department together through crises. But today, he looked powerless. He watched his wife with a worry he couldn't hide. He knew something the room didn't. He knew his wife's anger wasn't born from entitlement. It was born from something darker, something she never allowed anyone to see. Judge Caprio softened his tone the moment he addressed her. "Mrs. Mercer," he said gently, "before we begin, I want you to take a breath. You're safe here. No one is here to judge you as a person, only to hear the truth." The words hit her harder than anyone expected. Her expression faltered for a heartbeat, just long enough to reveal fear before she blinked it away. The stakes were far greater than a traffic ticket. For Evelyn, this hearing threatened the only identity she felt she had left. She wasn't just fighting a citation. She was fighting to protect the fragile structure of her life, a life built under the shadow of her husband's spotless reputation. And Judge Caprio, with his gentle voice and kind eyes, knew he was no longer dealing with a routine case. He was dealing with a breaking point. The moment the case officially began, the tension in the courtroom deepened. Evelyn Mercer stood upright, shoulders squared, trying to project a confidence she no longer truly felt. Judge Frank Caprio studied her carefully, the faint tremble in her hands, the stiffness in her posture, and the way she avoided meeting her husband's eyes. It wasn't the behavior of someone who simply didn't want to pay a fine. It was the behavior of someone holding something in, something heavy. Judge Caprio began softly. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm going to ask you again calmly. What happened that day during the traffic stop?" Evelyn swallowed. "I was running late. I didn't handle it well." "That's an understatement," one of the spectators whispered, earning a sharp look from an officer nearby. Caprio ignored the murmur. "The report says you told the officer he would regret stopping you." His tone wasn't accusing, just seeking clarity. "Why would you say something like that?" She looked down. "I don't remember saying it." Captain Mercer shifted in his seat, his expression tightening. He had read the same report, but seeing his wife confronted with it made his breath feel heavier. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Mercer, I've been doing this for decades. People forget moments, but they don't forget emotions. What were you feeling at that time?" Evelyn hesitated. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "I was overwhelmed. That's all." It was a practiced answer, far too neat for the messy look in her eyes. Caprio glanced toward Captain Mercer, who sat rigidly, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "There is a story here, one both husband and wife were afraid to let surface." He continued, "The officer described you as distressed, unusually distressed. That doesn't happen without reason." Evelyn exhaled sharply, as though the pressure was tightening around her wrists. "I said I was overwhelmed." Her tone sharpened, but Judge Caprio didn't react to the defensiveness. He simply waited. When she realized he wasn't moving on, her jaw tensed. "You don't understand," she finally said. "People expect something from me. They expect perfection. I can't afford to lose control." Caprio's voice softened. "Who expects that from you, Mrs. Mercer?" She didn't answer. Samuel Mercer looked as if he wanted to stand and speak, but his restraint was as tight as hers. Only his eyes revealed the truth, fear. Fear that the judge would uncover what he had spent years trying to shield. The judge tapped the file lightly. "This isn't about a ticket anymore, is it?" Evelyn's breath hitched. The room grew still. Even the officers along the back wall shifted quietly, sensing the shift in tone. Evelyn tried to redirect. "I may have been abrupt, stressed, but that doesn't make me guilty of anything beyond a citation." "And threatening an officer?" Caprio asked gently. She shook her head. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." "How did you mean it?" Her silence answered for her. Judge Caprio took a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Mercer, I want you to understand something. I don't raise my voice. I don't pressure people, but I see you. And right now, I see someone who isn't being honest with me or with herself." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, her confidence cracked. Not dramatically, not like a breakdown, but like a tiny fracture on the edge of a glass surface. Captain Mercer finally spoke, unable to stay quiet. "Judge, she's been under a lot of stress. The department, our home life, expectations from the community." "That's enough, Sam," Evelyn whispered tightly, not turning around. Caprio watched her reaction carefully. That whisper wasn't frustration, it was fear of exposure. He shifted his attention back to her. "Mrs. Mercer, when someone speaks from a place of fear, it's rarely about the situation in front of them. It's about something deeper, something they've been carrying." Evelyn finally looked up, really looked up. The facade wavered in her eyes. "You're asking me to admit something that could change everything," she said quietly. Caprio nodded once. "Sometimes, Mrs. Mercer, the truth doesn't destroy a person. It frees them." Her breathing grew uneven. She didn't respond, but something inside her had begun to loosen. The rising tension in the room made one thing clear. The truth wasn't far anymore. But when it arrived, it wouldn't just change the case. It would change their lives. A silence settled over the courtroom. Heavy, pressing, almost physical. Evelyn Mercer's carefully held composure trembled like a thread about to snap. Judge Frank Caprio watched her gently, not with the eyes of judge, but with the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding human pain. He spoke softly. "Mrs. Mercer, you're not here because you're a bad person. You're here because something inside you is hurting. Let's speak." Her breath caught. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her fingers twisted her bracelet, the same motion she had repeated since she first walked into the courtroom. Captain Mercer leaned forward from the back row, silently pleading with her to open up. But Evelyn wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at the judge, the only person in the room who wasn't judging her worth, only trying to understand her truth. Finally, her voice broke through the silence. "I didn't threaten the officer because I felt powerful," she whispered. "I said it because I felt powerless." The room stilled. Evelyn blinked rapidly, tears building but refusing to fall. "Everyone sees me as the captain's wife. The perfect woman who never makes mistakes. Do you know what it's like to be expected to be flawless every day? To never break, never fail, never show weakness?" Her voice trembled as she continued. "And if I do crack, even a little, it reflects on him, on my husband, on his career, on his reputation. So I walk around with this constant pressure sitting on my chest. Every hour, every day." She pressed a hand against her heart as though the weight was physically there. "And lately, her voice thinned. Lately it feels like I don't exist as a person. I exist as an image, a role, a responsibility." The first tear finally slipped down her cheek. "When that officer pulled me over, it wasn't him I was reacting to. It was everything. Years of trying to be perfect. Years of hiding panic attacks. Years of pretending I'm strong when inside I'm exhausted." A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Captain Mercer's jaw clenched as emotion welled in his eyes. Evelyn looked at him. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to be the reason you lost respect at the department. I didn't want to be the weakness they talk about behind your back." Samuel stood slowly, his voice low. "Evelyn, I never asked you to be perfect." She shook her head. "You didn't have to. Everyone else did." Judge Caprio leaned forward, his expression full of empathy. "Mrs. Mercer, listen to me." She looked at him, desperate for something. Relief, forgiveness, permission to breathe. He continued gently. "You've been walking around, carrying a weight you were never meant to carry alone. Perfection is not a requirement for being a good person, and it is certainly not a requirement for being married to someone in uniform." Her lips trembled again. "I've seen people from every walk of life stand where you are," Caprio said softly. "Rich, poor, powerful, struggling. And do you know what I've learned in all these years?" She shook her head. "That fear of failing, fear of letting others down, does more damage than any mistake ever could." His voice warmed, filled with wisdom. "You didn't break the law because you're entitled. You lashed out because you're overwhelmed. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is admit they're tired." The courtroom was silent. Caprio continued. "Mrs. Mercer, you don't need permission from the world to be human. I'm giving you mine today. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to not be perfect. And you're allowed to ask for help." A sob escaped her lips, quiet, but it carried more emotion than any outburst could. Captain Mercer stepped forward slowly, his voice thick. "Evelyn, I should have seen this. I should have asked. I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "I didn't want to disappoint you." Judge Caprio's gaze softened even more. "You didn't disappoint anyone today. You told the truth. And truth is the first step toward healing." Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the weight she carried finally slip from her shoulders. This wasn't just a confession. This was the moment her life changed direction. The moment her truth finally found a voice. A gentle quietness settled into the courtroom after Evelyn's confession, an emotional stillness that felt almost sacred. Judge Frank Caprio let the silence linger, allowing the weight of everything she had shared to breathe and settle. Then, with the softness of a grandfather offering comfort rather than a judge handing down authority, he spoke. "Mrs. Mercer," he began, "the law has rules. But justice has a heart." Evelyn looked up, eyes still red, her breathing uneven. She braced herself for whatever was coming, unsure whether relief or punishment waited on the other side of his next words. Caprio continued, his voice calm, steady. Threatening an officer is not something this court can overlook. But neither is the truth you shared today. You did not act out of malice. You acted out of fear, pressure, and exhaustion. And when someone is drowning inside, sometimes the world only sees the splash, not the person struggling beneath it. He leaned back slightly, hands folded. So here's what I'm going to do. The entire courtroom leaned in with him. For the charge, I am dismissing the threat allegation. You will not carry a criminal mark for this moment of emotional breaking. However, the traffic violation stands, but I'm reducing the fine to the minimum allowed. A small, shaky breath escaped Evelyn's lips, half relief, half disbelief. But, Caprio added gently, there is something more important than fines or charges. He paused, eyes kind. You need support, not pressure, not expectations. Support. Evelyn blinked, tears gathering again. So, he continued, I'm ordering you to attend a short counseling program, not as punishment, but as a pathway, because healing is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. Captain Mercer lowered his head and exhaled, his shoulders softening for the first time since the hearing began. Caprio wasn't done. He shifted his gaze to the captain. And Captain Mercer, support is a two-way street. Your wife has been carrying more weight than anyone should carry alone. You can be part of her healing if you choose to be. Samuel stepped forward, voice tight with emotion. I choose to. I won't let her walk this alone again. Evelyn's lips trembled as she looked at him. It was the first time during the entire hearing that hope flickered in her eyes. Judge Caprio smiled warmly. Good, because marriages aren't built on perfection. They're built on grace. He turned back to Evelyn. Mrs. Mercer, let this moment teach you something about yourself. You're stronger than you realize. Strong enough to admit vulnerability. Strong enough to speak your truth. And strong enough to start fresh. A final tear rolled down her cheek. This time not from fear or pressure, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being understood. Caprio gave a small nod. Case dismissed with compassion. The gavel gently touched the desk. Not in force, not in reprimand, but almost like a blessing. Evelyn didn't move at first. She just breathed, deeply, fully. For the first time in years, she felt the air enter her lungs without weight. Captain Mercer wrapped an arm around her shoulders as she stood. She leaned into him, not out of dependency, but out of rediscovered trust. As they walked out together, the courtroom watched not a woman who had broken the rules, but a woman who had finally been allowed to be human. Evelyn Mercer walked out of Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom with her husband beside her, lighter than she had felt in years. The fear, shame, and pressure that once kept her silent no longer controlled her. What could have been the worst day of her life became the beginning of a new chapter, one built not on perfection, but on truth, healing, and understanding. Judge Caprio's compassion didn't just settle a case. It restored a family, reminded a community of empathy, and proved once again why his courtroom feels less like a place of punishment and more like a place of humanity. Evelyn didn't leave forgiven because she was the wife of a police captain. She left forgiven because she was finally honest with the court, with her husband, and with herself. That is the power of a judge who listens. A judge who sees the person before the mistake. A judge who believes that every heart deserves a second chance. If this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of the kindness still left in the world, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Click like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and help us spread stories that restore faith in humanity. And don't miss our next emotional courtroom story, where a young single father stands before Judge Caprio, hiding a secret that could change the judge's decision and his entire life. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.